Welcome, welcome. Glad to have you all with us here this afternoon. Thank you for taking a few moments out of your beautiful summer day here to be with us. This is our summer quarter webinar, and Gary has some great material again prepared for us. It's entitled 3 Common Pitfalls in Financial Plans. So Gary, we're excited to hear what you had to share with us here this afternoon. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Lyle. We're definitely a little more provocative with the title today, so we're not trying to scare you into anything. If you're a client of Masters, our goal would be that you have 0 pitfalls. So hopefully we go through today and you're assured in the confidence of your financial plan. But at Masters, we're in the 3rd quarter, and in the 3rd quarter, we're thinking about risk management. We're thinking about insurance, liquidity, estate planning, and we're thinking about those what ifs. And so that's why we wanted to bring this to you today, since we're in that mode, to get us all thinking about maybe some things that we don't always love thinking about, but of course we need to address in a financial plan. So as always, any questions you have, send those in through the Q&A or through the chat. Lyle will pick those up as we go through this. We're going to pause a few times to answer questions and go through any clarifications that we get through that. So feel free to interact with us. And again, thanks for being here with us today. So we're going to start with just some basic risk management and talk a little bit about what that looks like and what we need to be thinking about when it comes to risk. And we're going to start with a fundamental principle that we think about when we think about a financial plan. And that is that we need to focus on what we can control. This is a sketch from one of our favorite authors, financial authors, Carl Richards. He draws these simple sketches that can explain concepts in a way that's extremely understandable. And this is one of our favorite ones. It's hanging in the wall of one of the conference rooms in our office. We only have 3, so if you can guess the one, I think Lyle will get you an ice cream at Fox Meadows or something like that. So go ahead and guess which conference room this one's hanging in. But the simple idea here is there's a lot of things that don't matter that we think about. There's a lot of things that we don't control that we think about. And where we really want to direct our focus is what can I control and does it matter to me? Not does it matter to someone else, not does it matter to the financial media, does it matter to me and my financial plan? And so we do everything under that lens. Another way to think about this is to break down, so what are some of these things that are in our control? What are some of these things that are out of our control? This is another graphic that I really like the breakdown. In purple up there at high noon, 10 o'clock in this graph, you see that we have total control over our saving and our spending. We have total control over how we allocate our investments, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. We have no control at 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock in blue on market returns, and we have no control, unless we're down in Washington, D.C., on policy in regards to taxation, savings, all the benefits around that. And so those are 2 things I would say we think about a lot and we read about a lot. And of course they matter because they affect your plan, but we really don't have much control over them. The market returns one is interesting. We don't control market returns, but we control our asset allocation so we can harness our investments to take advantage of the markets and provide return. And then there's some things that we have some control of: employment, earnings, and duration. How long do we work? How do we extend our earning power? And of course, your longevity, your health, your wellness, and your ability to live a full, healthy life. So there's some risks in there too that we're going to talk about, but it's a way to set the stage for thinking about our financial plan today. So we're going to go through 3 big picture, really principle-based risks today. And so these are, I would say, umbrellas that a couple of things fall under, but it's a way to get us to think about where might we need to refine some things in our plan. And our first one is another term I've picked up from Carl Richards that I love, and it's dollars without jobs. And so the concept here is every dollar in your financial plan should have a job. So every dollar on your balance sheet, every dollar that comes into your bank account throughout a month and a quarter and a year should be assigned to something and should be assigned somewhere. So we have our income, and we break that down a pretty simple way. Every dollar of income either needs to be for you to live, give, grow, or owe. And we break down the owe into 2 different categories, which are taxes and debt. And so every dollar that comes in should be assigned to one of those categories. Now you're probably thinking, Gary, does this mean that every single dollar that comes in a month I have to categorize and put it somewhere in the pie chart? Of course, I like to do that, but you may not want to, and you don't necessarily need to. The way I think about this breakdown is your taxes and your debt at this point are pretty much going to be figured out for you. You know your tax bill, you know your debt obligations, at least at a minimum. So we know what that's going to be. The grow is your savings. So what are you putting into retirement or cash to give yourself some buffer in the event that you need some, into various other investments, back into your business if you own a business. That as well is pretty much going to be accounted for and figured out. Then you have the give piece. Again, most of you have a giving goal. How much of your income do you want to give away in a given year? And if we take all those and add them up and subtract them from your total income, we essentially just back in to what you need to live. And live is just your regular expenses, all the things that you enjoy doing on a regular basis goes into that bucket. And we like to keep this simple, high level, big picture categories that you can back into. But it is important for you to have at least a big picture idea, and ideally your advisors as well have a big picture idea of where all your dollars are getting assigned their jobs. And then on the asset side, real big picture, you should have some assets for the short term, some for the medium term, and some for the long term. Those are real big buckets. We're going to dive in a little bit further to what those should look like. But if we're painting a picture, that's what we're looking at on the balance sheet. One thing we see a lot when it comes to dollars and jobs is that there are dollars that are going to waste, which means they don't have a specific purpose, or it's money that you put somewhere and you didn't pay attention to it or you forgot about it. We all have those sorts of things, very, very common. And those are the types of things that we want to make sure we assign somewhere. The few examples we have here are ones that we see come up commonly amongst our clients and even us sometimes. One is that we have cash that doesn't have a purpose. Maybe we're just sitting on a bunch of cash and we don't really know why, but it's there. We need to do something with that. That needs to be assigned a job. Maybe its job is keep it in cash because I need to buffer this risk or that risk, which again, we'll dive into a little bit more. Or maybe it's I just put stuff in cash and I don't know what else to do with it, and we need to move that to accomplish some other goal in your plan. Another one we find frequently are cash value life insurance policies. Sometimes we might have started one of these a long time ago, we paid the premium, but we don't really know anymore. Do I need the cash value? Do I need the death benefit? Or is that just sitting there? And a lot of times these are not huge numbers. Most of us don't have big portions of our net worth just sitting somewhere with no job. They might be smaller numbers, but every single dollar counts. We want every single dollar accounted for. So we need to look at that and say, do I still need this? Is this the best way to cover my need, or should I, again, do something different? And then the last piece for those old investment accounts, maybe you worked somewhere for 6 months or a year and you had a few $1,000s in a 401k somewhere that's still sitting there. Maybe your parents or grandparents gifted you money and you let it sit where they gifted it to and haven't assigned it anywhere, whatever that may be, we want to give those dollars a purpose. So how do we think about this? On the income side, again, this is how we think about it. This is just an illustrative example of maybe how your dollars will break down in this live, give, grow, owe philosophy for income. Again, this is an illustrative example, but this is really all we need to know. What are those big buckets? What should that give bucket be? In this case, it's 13%. Maybe for you, it's 10 or 5 or 15 or 20 or 30. Whatever that number is, assign the dollars there. The grow piece, what do you have to put away for the future? What do you need to invest? We want to assign there. The O piece, what are you going to owe to taxes? What are you going to owe to debt? And again, the rest of that, we back into that live slice of the pie. So make sure your dollars are accounted for. If you don't know these numbers, we can help you with that. We can help you figure out where you're at. But again, keep it big picture, and as best you can, try to keep it simple. The simpler it is, the easier it is to have a sustainable approach to giving your income jobs on a recurring basis. And on the asset side, again, very simply, we want to break down our assets of what's for the short term, what's for the medium term, what's for the long term. And what I like about this chart is it shows us the different types of options we have from a asset placement standpoint based on the goals. So if we're looking at short-term goals, which typically here at Masters, we say 2 to 3 years is what we consider short-term. If you've got money that you need for 2 to 3 years, you probably should have that money in cash. That's typically going to be our advice on that short-term piece. Maybe we can find something a little bit beyond cash, but cash or cash equivalents generally. The medium term, maybe you're saving up for a goal that you know is going to come in 5 or 10 years. Maybe you're saving up to pay off your mortgage. Maybe you're saving up to reinvest in your business, to buy a vacation home. Whatever that may be, we can take a little bit of risk there. Maybe we can invest some of that money, but we don't want to get too aggressive with it given our time frame. And then of course, you probably all know the long-term stuff, your retirement accounts, your 401ks, your long-term investing accounts. That's the stuff that we can take advantage of the market returns with and get fairly aggressive with up to your risk tolerance to generate that long-term return. What you're seeing on the bottom part of this slide is the variability of returns given your time frame. I know it's a little small and hard to read, but essentially what you're seeing here is if you look at a 1-year period, you're likely not going to lose money in cash unless something really, really wacky happens. You're probably not going to make a whole lot either, if anything, although the rates are going up just a little bit. But that's why you want that there. You want to know it's going to be there for the short term. Whereas stocks, if you're invested for 1 year, you may be down as much as 40% in a year. Of course, you could be up on the other side almost 50%, but you can't afford to take that risk in the short term. But if we zoom out and we look at those long-term goals, 10, 15 years plus, if we look at 20-year periods of time, the worst 20-year period of time for stocks, the very, very worst in history, gave you 6% a year. And so the longer you have, the more aggressive you can get from an investing standpoint. Here's another way to think about the different areas of spending and the different places that you need to assign your dollars. And this is structured as a pyramid to show you need this base level of spending, which should be all the stuff that you need to live, your basic living expenses, the things you want to do on a regular basis, the debt that you have to pay, the taxes that you owe, those all go in that bottom part of the pyramid. That middle part of the pyramid is your variable spending. So that's the stuff that, maybe you want to take a vacation here or there. Maybe you want to do something special here or there. Maybe there's a certain year where we need to make a large purchase. That would go in that variable spending bucket. We want to have some cash for that, but we're a little flexible on it. And then of course, that last piece is all the long-term stuff. It's called legacy here. Again, I would just think about it as long-term. Dollars that are not intended to be for now, dollars that are intended to be for later for some other purpose. And ultimately, what are we trying to get to? Ideally, we're trying to get to a long-term diversified balance sheet where you have different buckets of money for different purposes that you've built up over time. This is just one way to visualize all the various different buckets that you may have money in down the road that can serve different purposes for you when you're self-sufficient, when you can retire, when you don't need to work anymore. Health savings accounts, your Roth IRA, your taxable accounts, your pre-tax 401ks and IRAs. Ideally, when we get out there, when we get to the time where we need money from your investments, we want to have good diversification. And we need to think about our income today with an eye toward that goal in the future. That's what we're trying to get to give you the most flexibility down the road. And the last slide I have on this piece, dollars and jobs, is that the jobs are going to change over time. You know, early in life, you probably have more debt. Later in life, you probably have less. Early, you have less disposable income, and generally later, you have more. And with that comes a lot of other changes. Your tax rate changes as you earn more, as you grow more, your balance sheet changes, your spending changes. And so this is one particular example just showing based on your tax rate. So tax rate would be on the left-hand side. The lower you are on the left-hand axis, the lower your tax rate. The higher up you are, the higher your tax rate, and your age on the bottom. And this is simply an example looking at, should I contribute to a pre-tax retirement account or an after-tax Roth retirement account? And what you'll see is depending on how old you are and depending on your tax bracket, that decision is going to change. And so we want to keep coming back to making sure the jobs that you've given your dollars are still relevant for you on an ongoing basis. And of course, that's one of the things that we love to do as your advisor at Masters. So Lyle, I think that's a good place to pause and see if there's any questions on giving jobs to your dollars.
Yeah, a few questions. The first one, real practical question around emergency liquid funds. Where's the best place to put those right now to get the best return? The question is the online savings accounts, the banks online, is that the best place, or is there something else that we should be looking at for that liquid money?
Yeah, great question. We've got that question a lot recently. I think it's a good sign. It means there's a lot of cash out there, a lot of people doing a good job of saving. Again, we're always been the camp, if you need cash, have cash. So yeah, generally speaking, the online savings accounts are probably your best bet for that short-term savings. Depending how much you have, depending what the purpose is, you may want to look at some other options that we can help you look at. But in most cases, they say cash is king for a reason, and we certainly would hold to that. And the online bank accounts typically have the highest interest rates. Now, I think most of them are over 1%. So if you live back in the 70s and 80s when you were getting 18% on a CD, 1% doesn't sound too good. But we're coming from just a couple of tenths of a percent. So we're doing a little better than we were a year ago on
that. The next question, Gary, is semi-related, a little different. The question is, there's times where, this is with your savings dollars, there's times where you have some like foggy ideas about what you might use your money for in a year or two or three or whatever, but you're not 100% sure, you don't have complete clarity on what's the best thing to do with those dollars. Do you just keep that in cash, or do you put some of that into the markets? What's your thoughts about stuff that you don't have a clear clarity about the future on?
That's a fantastic question. It's always a hard one to answer in a format like this, because it typically has to be personal to the individual situation. But to give a high level, I would say that you first want to make sure all your immediate risks are covered. So for instance, do you have enough of a cash buffer on an ongoing basis that if you have a sudden large expense, if you lose your job, if you own a business and your business needs some cash, that you have that cash set aside? So that would be the first thing. Just make sure you're protected from a cash and liquidity standpoint first. If then you still have unallocated dollars above that, it's really going to depend on how much flexibility there is in your plan. And I'll give you an example of that. So let's say you have your emergency fund, but you got another chunk of money sitting there and you're not sure where that should be assigned. I would say if you're in a stable employment situation, if you operate with plenty of margin each month, you have good net cash flow each month, you do all your saving, your giving, your spending, your tax payments, and you've got money left over, you've got a healthy balance, so a stable job, plenty of margin in your monthly cash flow, then I would say you can probably think about looking for some ways to generate a little more return on that money, but I would put liquidity of that money at a premium. So maybe we want to invest it, but we want to make sure it's something that if we need it, we can get to it. We also want to make sure it's our second line of defense. Cash should always be our first line of defense. If we have maybe a conservative investment account as our second line of defense, as long as you've got good stability in other areas of your plan, we see that work for clients. So it depends on your specific situation, but hopefully that gives some direction. That's a great question.
The last question I have here is related to the screen we're looking at, these savings decisions and getting money into, pre-tax or after-tax buckets. What if you're in the position where you find yourself nearing retirement and you've got the bulk of your liquid assets, the bulk of your investments are in pre-tax dollars? What should you be doing? What should you be thinking about in that scenario?
Yeah, another fantastic question. Great questions today. Thanks for the questions. That's a fantastic one. We do see that a fair amount these days, because if you've been working for a solid period of time, let's say 20, 30 years, you probably have a 401k versus a pension, and you probably have not had a Roth option until recently, or maybe you never did, because the Roth 401k is a newer thing. So, oh, did I lose my screen here, Lyle?
No, I see it.
You've got it, great.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's a very common scenario that if you're in that 5 to 10 year range of retirement, that you have a large 401k that's all pre-tax. I would say two things on that. One, if you're very close to retirement and we know that right now your tax rate's here, and in retirement your tax rate's going to be here, you're probably still better off just sticking with a pre-tax bucket because of that difference in tax rates. The way that we can then plan around having all this pre-tax money is we look at Roth conversions after you retire. So after you retire, we look to take some of that pre-tax money, convert it over to Roth, paying tax on it to convert it to Roth, but now it's in a tax-free bucket in Roth. And because we convert it when you were retired, you were at a lower tax bracket. So it's really going to depend on your tax bracket. I would say most of the clients we see in that situation, we say stick with pre-tax, but it depends on that tax situation. If your tax rate's going to be similar in retirement to what it is while you're working and you're loaded up on pre-tax dollars, it probably makes a lot of sense to look at the Roth instead. So hopefully that answered the question. Again, some of these can get really personal, and I'd encourage you to just follow up with us on those, and we'll be happy to look at it and apply it to your personal situation. Great questions.
That's all we have for now. Again, reminder, awesome. If you have questions, stick them in there. We'll get to them. Thanks.
Great. So we're going to move on to number 2. Again, we've got 3 things we're going to cover today. And number 2 is pretty straightforward, but there's a little bit to it. And that's that there's just risks out there that we don't have covered in our financial plan. Again, here in Q3 at Masters, in our planning process and our total wealth management planning process, we're looking at all these risks. We're looking at each individual situation. We're saying, here's all the risks in this situation. Do we have them all covered? Now, Covered means something different to different risk types, which we're going to get into. But a lot of the time we see risks that are not covered, just not recognized, or not covered with any sort of insurance or backup plan, or we just don't see them properly accounted for. And so when we think about this, this is one of the tricks that our mind's going to play on us a little bit. And I'm calling it here salient versus a non-salient risk. A salient risk is something that's very easy for us to imagine, think about, and envision. As much as we hate to, it's fairly easy for us to think about getting in a car accident and dying. Okay, I know it's a morbid statement, but we can picture that. And unfortunately, we probably all know people who have died in some sort of accident or suddenly or before their time. And so we can picture that. That's a salient risk. An example of a non-salient risk that we typically find in having these conversations with our clients would be having a disability that doesn't allow you to work anymore. It's a lot harder for us to picture that. I was talking with a friend one time, one of my good friends, who's in the personal services industry. And so most of his work is sitting and talking with people and giving them advice and consulting with them and that sort of thing. And we were talking about disability insurance. He said, Gary, I mean, unless I literally cannot talk, I can't imagine how I'd ever be disabled. And he had a great point. And that disability piece is something that's hard to imagine. There's a few other risks that come into that category. But what we have to be careful of is we're going to be more inclined to cover the salient risk than the non-salient risks. And we might not properly understand which one is actually a bigger risk to us. In this life insurance versus disability insurance conversation, the risk of dying, the risk of being disabled, the life's a lot easier to understand, and pretty much all of us understand why we need life insurance. The disability one's a little tougher. But if you're under the age of 40, your likelihood of being disabled is 6 times that of your likelihood of dying. And so that's where some of these risks play a bit of a trick on us. And again, we just have to make sure we understand them, we acknowledge them, and then we have some plan, whether that's insurance or whether that's some other strategy, to cover them if they would have a major impact on our plan. Of course, another thing is risks change depending on your stage of life. If you're later in your career or if you're retired, the disability piece is not really relevant to you. But what could be relevant is you dying prematurely or living really, really long. That could be a potential risk to your financial plan, depending on your spending rate, or having some sort of long-term care medical event. And so we always have to be making sure we're accounting for our individual situations, our stages of life, and addressing the risks that are relevant to us at that time. And the last piece of risk that I'll be interested for some feedback on is be consistent in applying your risk philosophy. If you're generally risk averse and you like to make sure you're covered on risks by being more cautious with things, do that on a consistent basis. If you're not, if you're generally less risk averse, you're more risk tolerant and you're willing to accept risks and take them on and be confident in your ability to absorb the things that come, do that consistently. And my personal example on this today is warranties. So whenever you buy anything now, technology related, appliance related, you're offered a warranty. And so to take this to the extreme, I would say you should either never buy a warranty or always buy a warranty. That would be essentially how you'd become your own insurance company. The likelihood of something going wrong with a piece of technology or an appliance at some point in your life is pretty high. You're probably going to have that happen here or there, but you don't know when. So if you just buy a warranty here, but then don't buy it here, you're probably not covering the risk the right way. You're just rolling the dice that you buy a warranty for the right thing. And of course, I'm talking about some of the bigger ticket items, not when you buy something for 15 bucks off Amazon. But in general, I would say try to be consistent with that, because if you're generally more risk tolerant, don't ever buy a warranty. That way you've never paid for the insurance, except the fact that every once in a while, that's going to get you, that's going to bite you and cost you some dollars. But over time, you save all that money not buying warranties you didn't end up using. If you're more risk averse, then I would say always buy a warranty, because that means no matter what happens, even though you're going to spend more money on warranties than the risk tolerant person, you're not going to have these spikes where something goes wrong and all of a sudden you're out a significant amount of money for something. So I'll be curious to hear some feedback on that one, but if you're curious, I never buy warranties. Maybe that'll change the older I get, but if I take my own advice, it won't. So we'll see how I do on that one. Some of the common risks that we need to address that I think most of us understand, of course, premature death and disability, which we've talked about, unexpected loss of a job. That's one that's a little tough to figure out sometimes. We have these rules of thumb out here that you should have 3 to 6 months of living expenses always in cash in case something happens. But depending on your job, the stability of it, and the stability of the company you work for, that might change one way or the other, and it might as well with your risk tolerance. But again, that's just something we need to recognize and have some sort of plan for. If you own a business, losses in your business, owning a privately held business that's successful is going to be the best investment you ever make, but it comes with the risk that you have some years where it really hurts and you've got to cover losses. Do you have a plan for that? Increased expenses, either expected or unexpected. Are you ready for that? Do you know how you would absorb increased expenses? If you're retired, 2 pieces there would be living well past life expectancy. That's something we think about and plan for a lot here at Masters when we're putting together a retirement plan. But your plan looks a lot different if you live till 85 versus if you live till 100. You need more money to live longer. So we have to have a plan for that. Early retirement, whether that's your choice or not. Are you covered in the event of having to retire early for any variety of reasons? I would say anecdotally here, we've seen a lot of clients retiring in the past few years because it's just tiring right now. If you've been working in a high capacity job for a couple of decades, you're probably being asked to do more now than you ever have been for multiple reasons. And it's hard to withstand that. So we have clients saying, hey, I don't think I can do this 5 more years like I thought. I think I can only do it maybe 2. Can we make that work? And of course, we're always planning for those scenarios, but something we have to be ready for. And something that we said we don't have control over, but we do have to be ready for are changes in policy or changes in tax rates. I think the tax rates piece is most relevant right now since we're in this period of time with historically low tax rates, but also changes in policy that could affect you as far as taxation, Social Security, I know is one we talk a lot about with our young clients. What if Social Security is not there when I get there? Or what if it's only 50% of what it says it's going to be? Am I ready for that? Am I prepared for that? And I picked out tax rates because I think it's something we all understand. This chart's a little hard to see because it's a little small, but what we have here is just showing you the top tax rate going all the way back to the 20s. And you see, other than the 20s, we're about, and sometime in the early 90s, we're about as low as we've ever been. It's a pretty favorable tax policy right now that we have. And so we've all gotten used to that because this new policy, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, came in a couple of years ago. So we're used to these lower taxes. I think we all like these lower taxes. It's always nice to pay a little less, but we have to be ready. This law sunsets in 2026. And if nothing's done, it's going to go back to the old rate. So we have to be prepared for that. And of course, there's a bit of depth to this, of other reasons that we may get increased tax rates in the future that I know we've had conversations with a lot of you about. But we just need to be aware that these sorts of things can affect our plan. Maybe not to sending your plan from being successful to failing, but certainly affect it in a meaningful way. So this is how I like to think about risk. This is a chart that I think illustrates it really, really well, is how do you cover risks? And the first place I'm going to take you is to the bottom right quadrant of this chart where it says purchase insurance. What you have on the left is the probability of a risk event happening. What you have on the bottom is what's the impact of that probability. You see the purchase insurance box lines up with a low probability, high impact event. Something that's not likely to happen, but if it does happen, it's going to have a major impact. Of course, the easy example here is your home insurance or your car insurance. Something happens to your home, tornado rips through it and takes out half your home. That's a low probability event, but if it happens, it's going to have a high impact. If you total your car, again, unlikely it's going to happen, but it's going to have a very high impact. Those are the risks you want to look to cover with insurance. That's why we buy life insurance. It's unlikely if you're young and healthy that you're going to die, but if you do, it could be devastating, and the most efficient way to cover that is with insurance. So when we talk about risk, sometimes we think about risk being synonymous with insurance, but it's really not. That's just one quadrant of this risk matrix. If we look at the others and go one over to the left to the pink box, we have a low probability, low impact event. We say, that's all right. Something that's unlikely to happen, and even if it does, it's not a big deal. I'm just going to accept that risk factor. I'm not going to do anything to plan for it. That's fine. If we go up to the yellow box, we have contained risks, and that's with a high probability but low impact event. So something that's probably going to happen, but when it does happen, it's not a huge deal. We just want to figure out how to contain that risk. So again, back to the car example, something's going to go wrong with your car at some point. If you keep it for a long period of time, it's going to cost you some money. There's a high probability you're going to have a high repair bill. It's not going to have a huge impact if you got to fix up something that costs some money. So how could you contain that risk? Well, you could do everything you can to take good care of your car along the way to decrease the probability of having a larger bill down the road. So that would be one example of how we could contain a risk. And then the top right section, take preventative measures. That's a high probability, high impact event. So most of us don't have any of these. Hopefully we don't. Something that would be really bad if it happened and is really likely to happen. Hopefully we can find a way to avoid those. We don't have many of these, but that's just something that we need to figure out how to have a preventative measure on. A good example of this would be, think if you own a factory, a manufacturing facility that has big equipment that something could go wrong with. Things, of course, go wrong with large equipment and big, saws or lasers or whatever it may be. And so what you have in factories, you have extensive safety programs to make sure that when things do go wrong, the impact is kept low. And so that's the way to think about how to cover various risks. And the last piece I have on here, this is actually a business related to a business chart, but I think it's a very good illustration of the life cycle of risk for an individual. So you have a few lines here. The top line is sales. For an individual, I think about that as income. The yellow line is profit, what's dropping to the bottom line. And again, you could think of that as net cash flow for your household. And the blue line is cash. In this case, let's think about it as your total net worth. So we have sales, we'll think about that as earnings. We have cash, we'll think about that as your total net worth, your assets. And we have profit, we'll think about that as your net cash flow. Of course, early in life, just like early in a business, we don't have a lot of cash. We might not have any cash. And we certainly don't have much on our balance sheet. A lot of us probably came out of college with a negative net worth, right? We have no cash and we've got a bunch of debt. And we've got to work to get out of that hole. And of course, we don't have a lot of income yet either. But over time, our income increases. We're able to grow our net worth, dig out of that hole, and then start growing. And because our income increases and we have less obligations, we have more net cash flow. And so this goes back to what we talked about in number one, which is the life cycle of risk. Different types of risk measures need to be taken at different times in your life. And so we always need to be evaluating that and making sure we have a high level of awareness about what they are. So again, Lyle, there, I'm going to pause for any questions on this piece.
Yeah, I have a question here. It's related to sort of both this section and the previous section. That there seems to be a bit of a tension between, like, as you think about covering risks, things like losing your job, business risk, even things like a long-term care event. It seems like that is calling for us to put more cash on the balance sheet, allocate more to cash. So the tension that's in this question is with risk management pulling more cash, and yet we're also thinking about we need to assign jobs to dollars, having them work for us in the future. How do you manage that tension?
Another great question. Thanks for that question. So what I would say is I would go back to this chart and say, what's the impact of a risk factor? Because to cover a risk with something like insurance or withholding more cash, that costs money. That either costs me cash that I have to leave sit in the bank, that costs me an insurance premium. So we need to personalize the impact of the risk in each financial plan. And that's going to have a lot of different angles to it, just depending on your personal situation. The way I think we generally look at it as advisors would be, are we talking about something that would cost you some money but wouldn't bring down the whole financial plan? Or are we looking at something that could jeopardize your ability to achieve your goals? If we're in the former category, we can probably live with not spending dollars to cover it. But if we're in the latter category, it's something that could take us down or take down your plan. We need to figure out a way to cover that. And so it's all a cost benefit, and it is a balance. And again, I come back to, it's got to be personal, it's got to be individualized.
Mm-hmm. The one thing I think about with this question that comes up a lot is folks that are in retirement. They understand that a long-term care event's a significant risk. Haven't, for whatever reason, taken measures earlier in life to put insurance in play, and now we're trying to figure out how do we manage that. I think the one thing that does come up a fair amount is that there are preventative measures, not necessarily preventive measures of going into a long-term care event, but if that does happen, there are some estate planning techniques. There are some things that our government's put in place to help manage that risk as well. So again, we have other professionals, attorneys that are the specialists in this to help people through those types of situations.
Yeah, gifting strategies as well, Lyle. We've talked about that. Just where you have your assets, how you have them titled. There's a lot of things in there. That's why I come back to it needs to be personalized. The other thing I would add on to that is if you're retired and you're thinking, I don't know if I want long-term care or not, the more margin, so the more essentially excess dollars you have that you're not going to need to fund your retirement plan, the more margin that you have, the less of a pool it is to really need long-term care insurance. Now, I'm not saying that we just throw it out, but it's all on a spectrum. And so, yeah, it depends on how much margin in your plan. Some of it depends on your health and even the health history of your parents. And that could increase or decrease the likelihood of you personally needing some sort of long-term care. And so, yeah, again, it's a great question, and it's a balance. It's not a perfect equation we can add up. It's a balance that we have to work together to determine what the best approach is.
Good, yeah, thanks.
Great. So we've talked about risk in a few different ways. The third piece that ties into this, but again, I'm painting a little broader of a brush with it, is a lack of flexibility. This is really tough for a lot of us, especially those of us who generally think in a linear fashion, is how do we build a plan that's flexible? And so I want to give you a few reminders. The first thing is we talk a lot about goals with our clients, with each other, and we think a lot about goals. What are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to accomplish. And one of the things we like to say to just take the pressure down a little, because a lot of us say, well, I don't really know. For instance, me at my age, I don't know when I want to retire or what my expenses are going to be when I do. I'm not sure. I'm thinking shorter term. But to plan well, I still have to make a guess. And even if we feel confident in our goals and what we want to accomplish and what we know we want to do, goals are guesses. That's all. And it takes some of the pressure off of thinking about, oh, we've got to have these big, well-defined goals that we're really confident in, we're charging toward, we're going to try to accomplish. All that's great, but at the end of the day, goals are guesses. We want to keep making guesses. We don't want to get too fixed to them. We want to stay focused, but not too fixed. Want to understand the range of outcomes, the decision factors that could push that one way or other. If we have a specific goal, what could push that goal out further? What could bring that goal closer? And how would we deal with those situations? Another thing is we want to keep guessing. And that's why we talk a lot about goals with you, because we want to keep revisiting and saying, are these goals / guesses still right? It's still relevant for you in your plan? I would say more than not they are, but a lot of times they change. And I would say they change most frequently when you start to get closer to them. A lot of time we get closer to them and we say, oh, I can do this now. I'm going to accelerate this, or, you know, I'm not where I thought I was. Let's push this out a little more. Let's change it or shift it. But just keep guessing. And we love that process. We love those conversations with you. The other way to think about this, we don't want to think of a goal in a linear fashion. Just say we're trying to get from here to here, and here's how we're going to do it. Because we all know life's a series of ups, downs, ebbs, flows. Now, generally, we're making progress, especially with our financial plan, but it's never linear. And so we want to make sure we understand a range of outcomes. What happens if we don't work as long as we thought to, or we work longer than we thought to? What happens if we have more income to apply to our goals? What happens if we have less? What happens if we assume some things about the plan that are wrong? And we're going to make some assumptions that are good assumptions, but don't end up being perfectly right. Do we know how those will affect the plan? And that's the other thing we love doing with you is scenario planning. We look at, okay, this is our baseline scenario, but what happens if this happens or this assumption changes? How does that affect your plan, and how would we address it if it did? So instead of thinking of from point A to point B, think about a range of possible outcomes. And the beauty of thinking that way is the closer we get to our goal, the less the range of outcomes is wide. There's fewer, there's a shorter dispersion or a tighter dispersion in that range of outcomes. This is another Carl Richards sketch that I love. We try to picture the future, but we only know what's now and behind us. It could go a lot of different ways, but again, we want to understand that range. And you see in this chart, the closer we are to now, the tighter that range, the further out, the wider it is. We just need to be aware of what's going to send it one way or the other. What I picked out for this is really interesting. The expectations of workers versus retirees to retire at age 65 or older. So a lot of people expect to work past 65, and we're just picking a number. And current workers, they expect 64% of them, when polled, expect to work past 65. So 64% of workers expect to work past 65. What ended up happening is only 28% of them actually worked past 65. So we've got a huge gap between expectation and reality. What you see below there, the expected retirement age was 65, the actual average age was 62. And not all of these things, though, are bad. For instance, the most common reason that someone retired early that you see on the right is because they were able to afford it. That's a great reason to retire early. I thought I was going to have to work till 65, but I'm sitting here and Lyle's telling me I can retire at 62. Awesome, retirement, here I come. But then, of course, the second most common factor is a health problem or a disability. You just can't do it anymore. Number 3 on the list is that something happened with your job, your company downsized, your plant closed, your position was eliminated, whatever it may be. And then, of course, there's some other things there as well. The reason I picked this out is because it's one example of a goal that can change, and it might change for a positive reason, or it might change because a risk factor came up unexpectedly. And so we just have to be ready for the unexpected, and not necessarily plan for it, but know what we're going to do and know how much wiggle room we have if it does come. Of course, we think a lot about investing and how to be a good investor. This is a blown up chart of something I showed you earlier. This is another example. We're going to assume a rate of return on your investments. We're going to assume that long term you earn some rate of return on your investments. But depending on the time frame, we have a very wide range of possible outcomes. And in this, I want to point you all the way over to the 20-year period, because that's a long period of time. And I think it's interesting to look at, because you see there that green bar. So the green is stocks, the blue is bonds, and the gray is a 50-50 portfolio. And what you see is, even with stocks over a 20-year period of time, the best 20-year period of time was 17% per year in the stock market, which is, of course, an unbelievable number. It's way above average, but it did happen one time. It happened. And the worst is 6% a year. That's not terrible, but certainly if we projected 8% a year on your investments over 20 years and you only got 6, that would leave a serious dent. And so we're going to make some assumption about rates of return. We're going to make some assumption about inflation, the hot topic right now, and we're going to be off on that likely in some way. So we've got to make sure we understand what happens if we do better than our assumptions, what happens if we do worse, and how are we going to adjust in both those scenarios. Another piece of this is our behavior. So we went back to things that we control. What do we control? What don't we? One of the things that we control is our asset allocation. One of the challenges with investing that could affect our goals is if we don't invest properly for the place we are in life or for the assets we're looking at. I think you've all probably seen some version of this before that we've shared, but this just shows an example of if you were fully invested, so the first and highest bar on the left, in the S&P 500, you invested $10,000 in 2002, how much did you have 20 years later? Well, your 10,000 turned to 61,000, and you earned an average annual rate of return of 9.5%. What happened if the markets got choppy, we got nervous, and we said, you know, I'm going to sit this out. I'm going to go to cash. I'm just going to wait out this choppy market because it's not a lot of fun. And it's not. It stinks when the market gets volatile and choppy. We have to keep our heads. But if I would have missed the 10 best days in the market, my ending value is cut more than half. Now all of a sudden my 10,000 only turned into 28,000 instead of 62,000. So that's why it's important to have a clearly articulated, well understood investment philosophy that's personalized to you. When we have a clear goal, we have a clear plan, we understand the risks along the way, and acknowledge those risks and have them covered in some way, whether that's through insurance, cash, or just being aware, it's going to help us stay committed to this plan and likely going to lead to the outcomes that we need to make our plan work. And I'm going to finish it with one more Carl Richards sketch. I had a couple of them today, but like I said before, with goals, you got to keep guessing at your goals, and just embrace the planning process, because it's a cycle and it's a process. We don't project once and everything turns out the way we project it 30 years later. Things are going to change, be different than we think initially. And so we just embrace this process. We make goals and guesses. We set a plan. We find the investments. We find the strategies that fit the plan, and then we repeat. And sometimes we repeat and we don't change much of anything. And other times we repeat and we change a lot. And that's the value of the process. So with that, Lyle, we've got just a couple more minutes, I believe, to take any more questions that came in.
This question might just give you a chance to reiterate some of the things you've already said, but the question is, well, what's the point? You know, what's the point of doing in-depth planning if the range of outcomes is so vast? Like, why do I even take the time? Why don't I just have a couple good habits, like make sure I'm saving the right amount of money, and I'm not overspending, and I'm doing smart things with my money,
Yeah.
Why do I even bother doing in-depth planning?
Great question. Fantastic question. I would say that there are some cases, frankly, where that could work. You have a very simple plan, you stick to a few things, and over time, that can work for some people. So I wouldn't totally throw that out. I would also say that in-depth planning or planning for the margins, trying to find every efficiency we can, doesn't necessarily mean it's complex. It just means that we're covering all the bases that we can. The reason that we believe that's important is because that's something that we can control. So if we know that there's going to be some things go differently that are out of our control, what's one way to hedge against that, to try to neutralize that over time? It's do every single thing we can within our control to neutralize the effect of those unexpected things that come up. And so that's what I would say. If we know there's things we can do that are in our control to improve our long-term probability of success, it decreases the risk factors over time.
Great. I think that's all we have. So I'll just say thank you all for joining us here. Thanks for your time. As always, you have any questions, shoot them over to us, email us, give us a ring. We'd be happy to dig deeper into any of your personal situations, as always. So thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate the questions. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon.